All right. Part one of this webinar was about asking for feedback. But what about if you are the person who's being asked to provide feedback? What is the science behind giving feedback? Let's watch the second part of this video to find out.
Okay, well, we definitely want to spend a few minutes talking about the sharing of feedback, Rob, so I'll move us along because, you know, for everybody, all of you who've joined us today, you know, you've heard us make the case from NLI's perspective. You can see we've put our stake in the ground. We say that feedback is critically important. We also talk about, you know, from a brain-based perspective, how you know, approaching it from an asker-driven perspective can really make a huge difference, and it can help organizations with really the building of the feedback exchange that needs to take place from both the in terms of that giver and the receiver. So while we anchor on asker driven, it still means somebody has to be giving. Somebody still in that exchange or in that interaction will be providing the feedback. And so we want to make sure that doesn't get lost in the message. And so what's really the best way to do that, or how to do it from a brain-friendly perspective? We just want to take a few minutes to take a look at that now. And so when we're talking about the sharing of the feedback, what we want to do is ensure that we're in essence providing feedback in a way that's going to be most useful to the individual when somebody is asking. And I saw, you know, a few people made reference to that, how the feedback needs to be valuable, and it needs to be done in a way so that the person remains kind of intact, in whole, and we're not, you know, creating or elevating threat in them. So that's first. And we also want to ensure that the feedback, of course, that's being provided is being done in a way that is what we would say is digestible and actionable. And those that is also in alignment with what's brain friendly. So let's talk about how we suggest that you do it. And we really say it comes down to these three steps. We say that it's important to frame it for the individual. And interestingly, the question had come up about growth mindset, so we touched on it before. We can touch on it a little bit more here. We say contrast the behavior, so what was being observed or noticed at the moment versus what would have been ideal. And then lastly, get at the commitment element of it. So I called out earlier in our exchange about how the literature really says and questions, is feedback valuable? That's one of the points that is part of the debate, which is if it's not leading to people changing behavior, then is it really making a difference? Is there value in it? And what we say is if we help the recipient with the commitment aspect of it, then we can help, right, that individual be inspired to in fact make a change. So let's unpack that a bit. So first, just starting with that first step of framing. And as we said that, you know, we talk about it in the context of a growth mindset. And the research shows that, you know, when we do have a growth mindset, it can be particularly useful in a learning and performance space, and looking at these areas from a talent discipline perspective. When we're talking about growth mindset and feedback, that means there's a belief that improvement is possible, that the individual can do better, the person can improve or change, alter their way of how they're doing or handling something. And then secondly, there's a commitment also to growth and development in terms of that person doing better. So that actually can be addressed on both sides. So from the giver's perspective, that person sharing of the feedback, if they in fact have that growth mindset, then that means that for themselves as the sharer, they are open to new perspectives. So while that person as the giver has a point of view about the behavior that they've observed, and they can of course articulate that in the exchange, they can frame it. But having said that, having a growth mindset means there's an openness to what they might hear coming back that could in fact, alter that view. So it's recognizing that the giver being having a growth mindset makes a difference. And then for the individual as well, because when the recipient actually has a growth mindset, our research shows, and there are several of us who published an article about this a year ago, Transforming Performance with a Growth Mindset. And we cite Rob Orlando Crane, who was with Gap at the time, as one of the examples of that. But most importantly, we demonstrated how when a person has a growth mindset as the recipient, that they don't hear it as a threat, so it doesn't take them down that road, if you will. It puts them on the road of, they see it as a challenge and an opportunity, and it's something that they want to pursue. So you see this goodness that happens on both sides in terms of the giver and the recipient when it is grounded in a growth mindset. So that's the first step, we would say, when talking about the sharing of the feedback, to frame it that way. So here we just share some examples. I would imagine for all of you who've joined us today, you have a good sense of what this can look like. But the distinction is clear, right? We might, a sharer might be tempted to say, here's what you really need to change, right? Or I am so glad you finally asked me. Well, if that didn't put you into a threat state, I don't know what would. But the do different or the instead would be, thanks for asking. Or that last point, my goal is to help you get better, be better. I'm not here to judge, right? So these are all things that we can do to help lower threat that the person might be experiencing, framing the exchange like grounded in a growth mindset before then moving forward. Then we look at the next step of the contrasting. And so what we have been talking a lot about, Rob, you and I, we certainly saw it in the chat as well, which is, we have these blind spots. Some of that is just happening because of the natural functioning of the brain. The reality is so when the feedback exchange is happening, what the sharer is saying may not be the recipient's experience. It's creating some dissonance for them, right? It's a very natural thing that can happen for all of us as part of that interaction. And so what the research suggests is that because whether it's a blind spot or whatever the case may be, but that recipient is experiencing dissonance, what the sharer can do is help with contrasting, this mental contrasting. So helping the individual first recognize, here was the behavior that you displayed or used, right? That's what the sharer would articulate, their observation of that. And here's what would have been ideal in that circumstance, so they could see the difference. So maybe the recipient doesn't agree with it at that point, but the first thing to do is to help them understand what's taking place, and the contrast really helps that execution. So here we have an example of what that can look like. So,
Barbara, could I interrupt you for just a moment? Sure. We'll make that a bit of a cliffhanger.
Actually, I'm going to interrupt him, and let's skip his advertisement because we don't really need to hear it.
Or just move it to the side if we leave that running while Barbara and Rob continue. Sorry to interrupt, Barb. Back to you.
No worries. And as you know, we just have like one or two more slides to share with everybody. So we have some examples, Gabe, if you can go to that next slide. We were talking about contrasting. And so the first thing to do is just help the recipient see what took place, because they may not be aware of it. And so in this way, they can see, there's the tempted to say, here's what you should have done. Again, that will likely increase threat in the other, versus, suggesting, I think the way you're doing X works well. So we get to see that building on, and then keep doing it. I like to share some options for how you can refocus of the why, and ask the person, what are some ways that you think you could approach this? Here was my observation. What's your perspective on this? So now, as we know, it becomes more of this exchange and this opportunity for learning to take place, and the sharing occurring between the giver and the recipient of the feedback. So that's the contrasting. And then lastly is the commitment. And so again, getting at some of the point around the value of feedback, the real key is, are we having or cultivating experiences in such a way where the individual wants to do something about it, wants to be committed to it? So quick story, quick example for myself is I got some feedback, this was earlier this year, from a colleague during a client presentation. And the feedback was delivered beautifully, because what my colleague said was, when you framed for the client the 3 ways in which, from a brain science perspective, how we, our point of view and how we address that, he goes, that was beautiful. I love that you did that and how you actually itemized that for the person. And then he said, so that was great. Keep doing that. He goes, and then you continued on, and it was like this deluge of information. And he said, what I would have liked to have seen is, before you continued on to check in and ask the client, of these 3 that I've just mentioned to you, is there one in particular that really stands out for you, that's of interest to you, that better aligns with what's going on inside of your organization? He goes, and then Barbara, you could have focused on the one area that was most important to them. So there was a good example of the contrasting. And why I was prompted to think about it here in terms of the commitment is because of how that feedback was delivered, I literally changed how I now have this conversation with clients. And so it's just a good illustration of, again, the importance of feedback and the impact that it can have. But the real key is also these 3 steps we're talking about, with the framing, the contrasting, and the commitment, that can really make all the difference. And so that's what we wanted to share with everyone who's joined us today.
All right, well, we hope you found those examples of questions helpful, and we also hope that you're able to utilize them when you are giving feedback to others. Now let's do an activity to practice the use of growth mindset statements.